Okay. You ready? Are you ready for this, Tom? Are you feeling ready? Are you ready?
No, I'm not ready. I'm definitely not ready, but let's go for it.
Okay. Season 2, episode 1. Things are getting real now, Tom. We've got to take this seriously. Are you in the zone?
I thought we took series 1 seriously.
I mean, we might be taking it seriously, but now the world is taking this seriously. People are talking about carbon removal now.
Ah,
We're not just like chatting away with Ben, in our recording cupboards, having a bit of a laugh about carbon removal.
no, you're right.
It's not just us and Elon Musk anymore. Everyone's talking about this.
It's us, Elon Musk, his Twitter army.
The whole world. That means we've got to really, look smart and think smart. We've got to be on it. No pressure.
Thrive off the pressure. Let's get started.
Let's do it. Hello, I'm Emily Swaddle.
And I'm Tom Praviti. And welcome back to the Carbon Removal Show.
Hello, dear listeners. Welcome back. It's great to be here again.
It is, and we have so much to share with you guys this season. Lots of exciting stuff. We talk to new experts, we have new technologies, we have new questions, of course, and plenty of new recording locations.
Ooh, teaser, Tom, teaser.
Yeah, I know. I don't want to let the cat out of the bag just yet. Now, we assume that you've listened to season 1, and if not, then pause what you're doing right now, go back to season 1, episode 1, and give it a listen. It's great. Obviously, we're going to be biased. But it's important also to get a bit of a 101 on things in the carbon removal space if you're not so sure of the ins and outs of it.
And, we learned a lot in season 1 about what carbon removal is and why it's important. And we also came away with loads of questions about how to do it effectively and fairly and before it gets too late. So for season 2, we've gathered some of those questions and we've headed out into the world to try and get some answers.
That is right. Answers is what we are looking for. And we wanted to get outside the recording studio and into the real world, speaking with experts in their natural environment, as it were, about the work that they're doing to push carbon removal forwards. And the first place that we headed was London's Science Museum, a hotspot for school trips and tourists for, I think, over 160 years.
Very impressive.
I headed there without Emily. She had other plans, but I recorded the trip and took loads of photos for her collection.
Very grateful. Thank you, Tom. Did you get any photos of the spaceship, astronaut outfit, anything that's the futuristic version of a banana? These are the things I'm interested in.
Sadly not, no. The thing is, I was there on a very special mission. As some of you may know, for the last few months, the Science Museum has actually been hosting an exhibition called Our Future Planet, which is conveniently all about technologies that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It's sort of the museum equivalent in a way to our podcast.
Oh, high praise indeed. It's really interesting to me that this exhibition opened last year around the time that we were working on season 1 of the show. It really goes to show that carbon removal is having a big moment right now. And frankly, I'm here for it. Although I wasn't there for this little trip to the Science Museum, in general, I'm here for carbon removal having its moment.
Yeah, it's really exciting. And I know we'll be talking about that big moment more later in the season. Now, as well as looking around the exhibition, I got a chance to speak with Rupert Cole. He's the curator. Rupert showed me some of the highlights, discussed the process of putting it together, and talked about some of the decisions that they'd made around how to tell this carbon removal story.
Right. And I think that one of the things we were both interested to learn about when we heard about this exhibition was how can we have this conversation with the public? We touched on this a bit last season, but the more we're diving into carbon removal, the more essential we're realizing this is. Like, talking about carbon removal to the public is obviously something we are doing as podcasters, but it's also something that so many others have to do as well, whether they're raising investment, attracting customers, drafting policy, or organizing lobbying or activism efforts. However you're involved in carbon removal, you need to know how to tell people about it and how to have these conversations.
100%. And we're going to learn more about that over the course of this episode. I think it'll also serve as a good refresher for some of the things that we focused on in season 1. You never know, we might get some good tips on how to make the show even better.
Steady on, Tom. I don't know how we can improve on this. Perfection, as it is.
How can you improve on perfection? Exactly. Anyway, so I arrived with producer Ben a bit before our scheduled chat with Rupert, and that gave us a chance to have a good look around. The exhibition itself is quite small by Science Museum standards, but they pack in a lot, and we'll only be giving you the highlights from today. I should say that when we first walked through the exhibition, we actually went the wrong way around, which gives a bit of context to the next clip, but when Rupert arrived, he corrected us and assured us that this was a common mistake and talked us through some of the first exhibits.
Hi, I'm Rupert Cole. I'm curator of contemporary science at the Science Museum, and I'm here in the Tomorrow's World Gallery at the Science Museum, about to show you an exhibition we have here on carbon capture.
Rupert, do you want to take us, I guess, the right way around?
So when visitors come to this point, they would have gone through pretty much most of the ground floor of the Science Museum, including our Making the Modern World Gallery and our Energy Hall, which basically takes you through the last 250 years of industrialisation. And up to this point, they wouldn't have encountered climate change at all, so they would have seen the material history of industrialisation from steam engines up until space capsules, without really understanding, I guess, the climate impacts of these technologies, the industrialisation. So this point in the museum we're at the moment, Tomorrow's World Gallery, is the first moment they encounter this narrative. And at the beginning of the Our Future Planet exhibition, they come to an animation, and it basically links that, so the history of industrialisation with fossil fuel carbon dioxide emissions. And its starting place is carbon dioxide. We did quite a lot of research on how much visitors understand what carbon dioxide and carbon is. We realised we needed to actually use that as our whole jumping off point for the exhibition. And going round, you might notice we have these white crosses everywhere in the design, in our animation, and that was part of our way of creating a visual language for carbon dioxide.
So those crosses are all CO2, carbon dioxide?
Exactly, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, and so how have you laid out the exhibition after seeing this animation? What are they going to be interacting with first?
So the first part of the exhibition is very much an introductory section, and it situates carbon capture within the broader context of climate change. So the very first exhibit is a series of newspaper front pages, all the nationals from the UK. It was on the 10th of August 2021, just after the publication of one of the seismic IPCC reports. And it was a real sort of special material culture moment where all the newspapers aligned in reporting it on their front page. And particularly with the image, I don't know if some of your listeners might remember it, a Greek woman surrounded by wildfires, and it became a sort of icon of this moment of panic, of alarm, of the fact that governments around the world and leaders needed to kind of wake up and do more about climate change. And we thought this was a really effective way of situating carbon capture in the context of immediate action needing to be done, and carbon capture being, I guess, one potential option we can pursue and the scientists and engineers are working on, and this exhibition is going to explore that.
Okay, quick terminology check. I noticed there that Rupert uses the term carbon capture rather than carbon removal. I know that the terminology in this whole space is still a bit inconsistent. We have talked about that before. I've always associated carbon capture with point source technologies, i.e., removing carbon from a flue stack during fossil fuel burning or as part of BECCS.
Yeah, and me too. I had a similar thought, and I actually spoke to Rupert about this. He actually gave some good reasons for their choice of phrasing here. He explained that at the time of putting together the exhibition, carbon capture was appearing commonly in the scientific literature. It's also alliterative, which helps with getting people to remember it, and it's sort of self-explanatory in a way that other terms maybe aren't. And while he admitted it is a generous use of the term, it's worth noting that the exhibition does touch on this point source approach, at points, get it, alongside what we'd think of as true removals. So it made sense to them to have a term that attempted to cover everything.
Yeah, I sort of understand his reasoning, and particularly when we're talking about making this as accessible as possible to the public. I don't know, what do you think, Tom? Is it important to align scientific jargon with the language that the public uses?
I honestly felt mixed about it. I suppose my worry would be that people might have read damning things about carbon capture in the press and then think that that's the whole story on carbon removal when it isn't.
Yeah, that's a good point. My gut tells me that the dust just has not yet settled on the language used in this industry. And we'll probably have a few more years of confusion and miscommunication before anything becomes properly cemented in the public lexicon.
Language aside, the exhibition uses a full range of visual techniques to engage its audience and tell the story of carbon removal.
A luxury that we sadly do not have as a podcast, famously a non visual medium.
Yeah, exactly. So we heard about the newspaper front pages. There are also these little crosses on walls that represent the CO2 in the atmosphere, and they're scattered throughout the exhibition.
From my perspective, even hearing Rupert talk about the newspaper display was pretty powerful. And it starts off the exhibition with a nod to the crisis that we're currently in before we dive into the solutions.
Yeah, it was an impressive visual kind of kickoff if you're there in person as well. And that image was chosen in the first place because it's just so emotive.
Rupert also mentioned the research they did to understand where their audience is starting from in terms of what is carbon dioxide, what is carbon. That feels like a really important part of making this whole topic accessible, not assuming a certain level of knowledge or understanding.
Yes, although it would be impossible to cater to everyone all the time, the visual elements of the exhibition really helped with that too.
So the next exhibits we encounter are ways of visualising carbon for visitors. So we have 2 Hessian sacks of coal. And yeah, I heard in curating the exhibition, some people had actually never encountered coal. So we thought it was quite useful to actually show this really prevalent example of fossil fuel which powered the Industrial Revolution. And we also put a diagram to kind of give a sense of how much energy can be produced from just one bag of 50 kilogram coal. And it's kind of surprising actually, coal is massively efficient. Initially we had this diagram as showing an iPhone, but the amount of iPhones you had to put on a diagram to show one bag of coal was too many. So yeah, we instead put it into a house. And yeah, using the information we gather from one source, which we cite, it powers a home for 38 days. And then next to this we have another exhibit of coal in a different form. So these are old fossilized coal samples, so you can see some imprinted tree bark from 300 million years ago and some imprinted fern. And this was really about making that connection between, I guess, the fossil and the fuel and the process by which fossil fuels are created over hundreds of millions of years. And then next to it you see they're burned in a power factory. So it's about kind of communicating to visitors those vastly different time frames and highlighting it as a finite resource which is not easily renewed.
If we zoom out a little bit, it's actually crazy that we don't encounter something like coal anymore. Go back a few decades and people had coal in their homes, people interacted with it every single day. And these days we're just so distant from our energy sources. We don't even see the petrol that we're pumping into our cars, for example.
Yeah, that's so true. And it feels as though distancing ourselves from the substance could be part of distancing ourselves from the related crisis. Psychologically, it feels like less of a responsibility, sort of out of sight, out of mind.
Walking around an exhibition like this, it's easy to miss just how deliberate each of these curation decisions are. And I asked Rupert if he could tell us more about the team behind this.
This particular exhibition is part of Our Tomorrow's World's gallery space, which specialises in contemporary science exhibitions. It's, I think, our smallest exhibition space, and we usually turn it around every 2 years, sometimes every 18 months. And the team tends to be quite small, so it usually consists of one curator, an assistant curator, an interpretation specialist, and a project manager as our core team. The way we develop content at the Science Museum is a mix of different expertise and backgrounds. So a curator will often be the person coming with objects, collections, ideas about narratives. And then we also have on the other side of the content coin, interpretation people who are specialists in audiences and specialists in thinking about sort of learning outcomes and key messages, and really about translating curatorial knowledge into displays and different techniques of communicating messages.
The idea of an interpretation specialist is so fascinating to me. I think I want to be an interpretation specialist.
I know, right?
But when I hear Rupert speak about it, of course, it makes sense that this would be an integral part of the team. Scientists, for all their brilliance, they aren't always the best place to have these conversations with the public in a way that's the most accessible. And so having someone whose sole job is to bridge that gap, it really feels like a valuable model for how we can take these complex ideas and put them in front of a wider public in a way that we can all actually be part of that conversation.
Right. And it's about making sure that you're giving something to everyone. If you've ever been to the Science Museum, you'll know that there are loads of kids and families there. But for an exhibition like this, there'll also be people with an interest in the topic who may already know a bit about some of these technologies. Us, for example. What you have to do is cater for all. And it's kind of like a Disney movie where you're telling the great story to the kids, but there's some slightly adult humor that only the parents will get and enjoy.
Or at least you hope only the parents will get it. And then as you grow up, this has actually happened to me, like watching Disney movies as an adult. I'm like, no idea that they had those jokes in there. Back to the Science Museum, they're actually doing the same thing as what we're doing, which is telling a story. And this is such a new subject, comparatively, that there's a lot of flexibility about how to tell it.
We've already touched on the fact that this is a visual medium with all the storytelling tools that come with that. Rupert showed us a few exhibits that really use a broad range of techniques which engage different senses, whether that's to provoke debate or to evoke particular feelings.
We're moving out of the introductory area and into the first section, which is all about nature-based solutions and carbon sinks in particular. For this exhibition, we decided to focus on woodlands and forest ecosystems as our carbon sink, mainly because we were thinking of a UK audience and what they were most familiar with, and forests and woodlands have a really prominent role in sort of UK culture and history and UK psyche. But this diagram here shows that they are just one of many different kinds of ecosystems which can be carbon sinks. So we have examples of seas and oceans, bogs, swamps and peatlands, and we map this around the world to try and give that, I guess, geographical sense, and also hint that this isn't just a UK exhibition, a UK problem. So yeah, this is the forest section, and as you move into it, it's really reflected in the design. So you see on the walls of the exhibition different kinds of trees and foliage, and we picked them particularly for UK species. And one of the first displays you come to here is a video which includes experts talking about forests as carbon sinks and nature-based solutions, particularly from conservation perspectives, asking questions like, can we just plant more trees, and why isn't it as simple as that? And with these videos, we thought it was important to include the voices of experts and not just the museum voice, because some of these things can be controversial and there's different arguments. So we use these techniques sometimes to give voices to different points of view. On the right here, we have an array of light boxes and video screens. And this isn't really a content-heavy piece. This is very much supposed to be a reflective, more mood piece to kind of introduce forests to our visitors in their more aesthetic qualities and to kind of evoke the beauty, the well-being, those kind of things that we experience from being in these environments. We wanted to show a variety of different woodlands as well, across seasons, in different types of woodlands, like ancient woodlands, but also trees and forests in urban environments as well. Yeah, I guess one of the things we wanted to highlight with this was that trees aren't just carbon capture machines. They bring lots of other benefits too. They are havens of biodiversity. They provide cover and coolness in cities. And I mentioned well-being. They're also places for us to experience and improve our mental health.
This feels like the Science Museum's version of think global, act local. Forests are literally close to home for a lot of people in the UK, and that's the majority of the audience for this story. So, although we know that this is a global problem, we also know that solutions work best when they're specific to local context and culture. And there is a lot of potential for UK-based carbon removal, and some of it is already a reality. But forests in particular, I think, tug on the heartstrings of the British public. We love a good forest, as Rupert said.
You especially, Emily.
I honestly love a great forest. Ugh, such joy.
It's also generally the most well known carbon sink and the solution that many people will jump to instinctively, so it engages that wider audience in that way too. It's a good place just to start, and that's where we started with season 1 after all.
The exhibit reminds us that these entities we're using as a technological solution are actually living beings, and their presence in our environment has value beyond what we use them for. It's beautiful. But it gets complicated because, as we know, planting trees is not the silver bullet to saving the world. There's a bigger picture here.
The Science Museum actually collected a range of objects that measure just how good trees and forests are at storing carbon and how vulnerable they are in a changing climate. As we discussed in our trees episode of season 1, there's actually an incredible amount of technology involved with measuring and managing the carbon that's locked away in trees and soils and forests more broadly.
I am super curious about these objects. Did they have like a satellite on show doing some sort of like LiDAR measurement?
They didn't actually have a satellite, but they did have a video of the LiDAR process, showing an instrument orbiting Earth, scanning entire forests with lasers, building up that three-dimensional map of the world's forests, and, all of the carbon that's locked within them. They also have some very interesting objects that measure the carbon content of forests on the ground. They had this really battered and beat up R2-D2 lookalike, which is the machine that measures the respiration of CO2 from the soil. Rupert pointed out that the reason it was so smashed up was actually because a tree had fallen on it during a storm.
Oh no! Poor R2D2.
So sad. But it just goes to show that these sorts of things are really working in the field and not just in labs. Interestingly, Rupert explained that as well as collecting objects for this exhibition, the team were on the lookout for objects to add to the Science Museum's permanent collection. Climate change and the technology that responds to it is obviously a huge part of our scientific history, and the museum is keen to reflect that. They love stuff like our friend R2D2 that comes obviously well used and which tells that story.
Yeah, I love that. You don't want something that's straight off the shelf. It's got to have some experience in the field, It's got to have been out there. It's got stories to tell. It's really cool to think that future school children might see this exact object in the museum in years to come, maybe for many more years to come. And it's a reminder as ever that we're in a really important moment in history for the climate crisis and for carbon removal.
Totally. And on the subject of history, as you turn the corner of the nature-based solutions part of the exhibition, you're immediately struck by this enormous contraption that certainly caught my eye. It's the biggest and tallest display in the room by far, and it's something you're unlikely to have seen before.
So we've just left the forest section, and the whole design of the exhibition changes from the kind of forestry landscape of the walls to a much more stripped back industrial grey feeling, and this was supposed to mirror the change of content towards the more industrial technological projects that we're highlighting. And the first one you come to is really our star object, and it's sitting about 10 feet, 15 feet high in a kind of industrial structure. And this is Klaus Lackner's mechanical tree prototype. And it really is a stunning object. It was designed with trees as the inspiration. So to me, it looks like a futuristic object from the 1950s or 60s, aping a tree. It's very mechanical, it's very prototypey. It's complete with an emergency stop button, which for me, any prototype worth its salt should have. And it was developed by a scientist called Klaus Lackner in the US. And he was a real early pioneer of direct air capture. And he was trumpeting it in the early 90s when scientists were very unsure if this could ever be scientifically or economically viable. This particular object, I think, is one of his latest prototypes from 2017. And he tested it in the Arizona desert. And it's got a really great story of how it was tested in that severe heat of the desert. And all the electronics would regularly fail because of the heat. So he invested in a beer fridge to cool them. And you think of sort of companies developing sort of high technologies, and he just got an off-the-shelf beer fridge. And we actually acquired that for the Science Museum's collection to tell that story. Not on display here, but in our storehouse. But the way it works is kind of like a tree, and he constantly sort of uses the anatomy of a tree to explain it as part of its, I guess, mechanical anatomy. So the structure at the top, which he describes as branches, contains polypropylene leaves. These are kind of brown, fabricy looking things which are coated with a chemical sorbent. And the idea is as the air passes over them, it strips the carbon dioxide from them chemically, which then, once it's fully saturated, the branches then mechanically go down into its base. Water is then pumped through, and then the reverse chemical reaction happens that the CO2 is stripped back from that sorbent with the water. The water can then be extracted, and the carbon dioxide liquefied can be either stored or used. The branches then come back up and are ready to absorb carbon again. So staying on Lackner, we also have a really early sketch from the 1990s he made of a carbon capture machine he thought could be developed. So he was actually inspired to develop a direct air capture machine from his daughter. So his daughter had to do a science fair project. His daughter's idea was to absorb carbon dioxide from the air using a water pump from an aquarium and sodium hydroxide. And he was amazed at how well it worked. And it was from then that he began his own research program into direct air capture. And for us at the Science Museum, we love seeing science and technology in development, the process and practice of science, not just the kind of finished article, but if there's ways of documenting that process, it's fascinating, particularly for such a pioneer as Lackner.
I think I've spent so much time looking at direct air capture machines made by Climeworks and others that when I saw Klaus Lackner's mechanical tree, I was actually quite taken aback. So although it definitely takes inspiration from trees, it actually doesn't look anything like a tree. Imagine one of those hydraulic scissor lifts that window cleaners use, but there's no cage to stand on at the top, and the cross arms that extend upwards actually have layers of tightly stacked pieces of paper. Now, I'm sure it's not paper, but I'm just trying to give you a visualization here. Honestly, it looks like some sort of early Transformers or another Star Wars type thing.
Getting a lot of Star Wars references today. R2-D2. This looks like a robot that might have come out of that universe.
Yeah, I got it on the brain.
Were you a bit disappointed, Tom? I know how much you love a direct air capture machine. Like, I've seen the excitement in your eyes when you've seen one in real life.
No, this was really cool. It looked totally different from, like I've said, the direct air capture machines that we see in the papers today and that we will maybe see in future episodes. Yeah, it was really neat to see. It was very inspiring.
Sounds really cool. I really want to go and see this exhibition when my plans allow, when I can pencil it in. What's so striking to me is that, firstly, these early carbon removal solutions are inspired by nature, even if they do look a bit different. And we know that most carbon removal solutions since have also borrowed from nature in their method, design, and deployment. I mean, nature really is the best teacher. But also, inspiration can come from unusual places, like his daughter's science project. That's amazing inspiration for any budding carbon removal entrepreneur out there.
And it's never too early to start designing carbon removal solutions.
Get your kids on it.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess this also tells us that this whole space isn't as brand new as we might first think. People have been dreaming this stuff up for decades, and we're now in a place where it's actually happening. We're moving to deployment, we're moving to market. And it's a real testament to those early visionaries like Klaus Lackner who understood where things were heading.
This podcast is brought to you in part by Patch. Patch is the platform that powers climate action and makes it easy for businesses of all sizes to neutralise a carbon footprint or contribute to vetted, high-quality carbon removal and avoidance projects. A perfect fit for this show, don't you think, Tom?
Totally. Patch enables companies in fintech, crypto, travel, shipping, e-commerce, and more to estimate the carbon emissions of specific transactions like shipping a package and embed carbon removal directly into their products or services to account for those emissions, all with just a few lines of code. That means businesses and their end customers can be more sustainable and participate in impactful climate actions through a trusted platform.
What's more, Patch also allows companies to make purchases of vetted carbon credits directly from their platform. They find the best project developers doing the hard work of carbon removal, and companies get access to all of them in just one click. Head to patch.io/ TCRS to get free access to their platform.
Now, one of the final displays that we stopped at was a Science Museum favourite, something interactive.
So the Science Museum is really well known for having interactive displays, and we have one in this exhibition where visitors can answer imagined policy questions on environmental issues. The idea is the visitor is given a policy question, so should all fossil fuel companies be taxed if they don't decarbonise immediately, for example, and you can approve or reject this as a policy. At the end, it puts you on a spectrum of where you sit in terms of how interventionist you are in terms of policy and how much you want to leave it to the free market. It was quite interesting we developed this with COVID in mind as well, as normally our interactives are very hands-on and it's quite difficult to design them in a safe way with COVID in mind, so in terms of touch. But this one, you can actually approve or reject the policy by just waving your hand over a light, so no touching involved.
So we've got Champion for Choice as one category you can fall into, Positive Persuader, Policy Hero and Crackdown Controller. I would imagine Champion for Choice is someone that perhaps says no to a lot of those green policies, and then the Crackdown Controller is the one that says yes. What went behind the framing of those?
Yeah, so in terms of the names and the labels we gave them, we kind of didn't want to make any of them sound negative particularly, so we worked with our interpretation person to make sure they were essentially positive in the way that they were described, to not kind of alienate anyone who fell into any of those categories. As you'll see from that, most people fall within the two middle categories. I don't know if that's reflective of Brits, who are very sort of moderate in their views, I guess, in politics, or whether it's something to do with the way we set it up and it tends towards not putting you into the extremes.
Something to mention here is that you had to answer quickly, so it was eliminating overthinking as much as possible. And once you'd given your answers, it shows where you sit on the broader environmental spectrum. Questions went beyond just carbon removal, they were across climate policy in general. But it's interesting. People may think of themselves as having a particular broad viewpoint on environmental issues or aligning with the policies of a particular party. But sometimes our answers to specific questions differ, and this felt like a clever way to highlight this.
That's interesting. Yeah, I see the merit in that, but I'm not sure how I'd feel about being labeled a crackdown controller, In trying not to make the game too divisive, I think they've managed to actually stigmatize that role in particular.
Yeah, I kind of find it hard to disagree with you here, and I think there are some bigger questions there. It's so important that we get democratic involvement, but we also need to consider what comes next, what's informing these views. There's a lot that displays like this can't cover, but it is one way to open the conversation. Now, there were a few other exhibits that we walked through. There was a direct air capture machine from Climeworks. Rupert talked about how this kind of demonstrated some of the commercialization of the technologies we've been discussing. There were also really interesting visual representations of carbon locked away, such as basalt rock, where you can see it's been injected into it. Long-time listeners of the show will also like some of the other things that we came across. Vodka, pens and crayons made from captured CO2.
Yeah, it's cool to see the carbon locked away in things. Could you actually see it in the rock?
You can kind of see these little white flecks. They look almost like tiny crystals within the rock itself, but that is the mineralized carbon.
That's really interesting. Still waiting for those diamond earrings, though.
As our time at the Science Museum sadly came to an end, we were able to grab Rupert to discuss some of the wider questions behind the exhibition and why it's there in the first place. One question I think is just like an interesting one. Why now?
I suppose the contemporary science curatorial team are always looking out for current trends that we should represent. Tends to be things where science and technology is potentially having a big impact on our everyday lives. And this particular space, Tomorrow's World, as the name highlights and pays homage to the old BBC series. We're sort of looking to the future and what are going to be the sort of big changes in our society relating to science and technology. And I think with carbon capture, utilisation and storage, there was a report by the Royal Society which came out in 2018, I think called Greenhouse Gas Removal. And they were commissioned, I think, by the government to look into this. So we quickly realised this was going to be a core part of, I guess, government strategy going forward. And for that reason, we wanted to give our visitors an introduction to this topic, which was going to increasingly become part of their lives in the UK. So for us, it was about introducing them to the topic and giving them the tools to kind of critically engage with it, particularly as it becomes more common in policy discussions. But yeah, as we might start to see direct air capture machines popping up on our landscape, I think now is the right time to do it.
How's it been perceived? Like, have you got any feedback from attendance?
Yeah, so we've just started to do what we call summative evaluation, where we sort of do a real deep dive into visitor responses. And usually with that kind of evaluation, we do a survey of, I think, about 1,500 visitors who've been through the space. And it's a mixture of observation work, but also detailed interviews. And I'm trying to think, I haven't digested yet, the report in its entirety, but some of the things we learned were visitors still are really attracted to those big object moments, which you mentioned earlier. So the Lackner tree, but also Climeworks were among the two favourite objects that they came across.
Since opening, have new things cropped up that you guys would want to add to the exhibition if you could, or like how has thinking changed since the exhibition was launched?
Really, really good question. I'm not sure there's any kind of exhibits or objects that we thought, I wish we'd put that in. I think one thing we did see come up in the news cycle, which confirmed our belief that we should be doing this exhibition, was it was acknowledged, carbon capture in the most recent IPCC report, as being part of the kind of necessary solutions endorsed by scientists. And I think for a while carbon capture has been quite controversial, whether it's entirely necessary or a distraction from the most important thing that we need to do, which is emissions reduction, which we do acknowledge all the way around the exhibition. Emissions reduction is central. We were kind of wrestling with that question of it being a controversial solution, but I think its recent endorsement really confirmed to us, yes, it is worthwhile doing as a topic, and it was worthwhile doing in a kind of balanced introductory way, which is the way we positioned it for this show.
So, Tom, how do you feel about it now? What are your reflections on the whole exhibition?
I think it was really brave of them, in a way, to put on this sort of exhibition. You know, it's tough to launch something like this on carbon removal when so much of the science is still being deliberated. But it's the Science Museum, after all, the home of human ingenuity. So it makes so much sense that they did this first.
They don't tend to wait for the science to be fully formed, you know? And I don't think their intention is to present a scientific report either. I think we can see from their exhibition, from the decisions that they made, that it was about more than that. You know, they evoked emotional connections and they drew on the natural curiosity of their audience. There's a lot of layers to it, more than just the science, I think. At the start of this episode, we talked about how communicating carbon removal is something that loads of us are going to need to start thinking about, not just us people who make podcasts about it. And for me, this was my big takeaway, that even though this is a complex and technical subject, it also touches on so many things that have a really emotional pull. And maybe that's the best place to start the conversation, whether we're starting with that sense of connection with nature and natural environments, or the excitement that so many people feel when they see those big ticket futuristic contraptions that Rupert was describing. Like the joy I see in your eyes, Tom, when you see a direct air capture machine.
My eyes light up.
They truly do. So when we're talking about carbon removal with people, you know, telling them what it is and why it's necessary and getting into all the technical stuff, we need to be mindful of the existing feelings surrounding all this. And, you know, be open to having that two-way conversation as well, just like the interactive display at the end of the exhibition was starting to do.
And I think it's about acknowledging that you're always just going to be speaking to loads of different audiences. You know, if it's someone that's got different values or levels of knowledge and understanding when it comes to climate and tech like this. And with that in mind, it's just really important for us to have this diverse toolkit of messaging and different techniques. I think for me, though, the language question is still a big one. The Science Museum, as we discussed, used that term carbon capture as a catch-all really for the true carbon removal that we always talk about, and then the point source capture side of things. And it makes sense. You know, it's about simplifying this complex space for a broader audience. But you also, I think, need to just consider the context of what people may have already heard and the preconceptions that they might be bringing to the subject. We know even phrases like net zero and sustainability also come with this complex baggage and their own interpretations and their own histories of controversy. So it's really on all of us working in this space to make sure that we're just being clear and striving to be honest. And I think that really starts with thinking about the words that we use.
Look at you! You're talking about language. I'm so proud.
Yeah, I think I've become a bit of a language nerd convert off the back of all of my conversations with you, Emily, and the ones we had with Tom from last season. Thank you. We also want to say a huge thanks to the Science Museum for having us and obviously to Rupert for showing us around. If you are listening to this episode soon after its release, you can still catch the exhibition, and we would highly recommend that you go and visit.
It's funny to think that just a year or so ago, we felt that we had to convince people, at the beginning of season one, we were trying to convince our listeners, our friends, ourselves probably, of the legitimacy of carbon removal, no matter what term you use to refer to it as. We were trying to convince people that this topic is important and it's valuable and the world needs it right now, even if we're still trying to reduce our emissions. And it feels like even a short time later, more people are talking about it. More people are on the same page as us. Like the Science Museum's doing a whole exhibition about this. And hopefully, as we move down the line, carbon removal could actually be a big part of our lives in the future.
So you're saying we're legit?
I think we might be legit, Tom. Yeah, we may have crossed that boundary.
Us and carbon removal are legit.
For real.
I love that.
It's worth noting that the Science Museum has been on the receiving end of some bad press and a series of protests in relation to their receiving sponsorship from fossil fuel companies. As some of you may know, this particular exhibition was sponsored by Shell. Extinction Rebellion wrote to the Science Museum stating, "Sponsoring arts and culture makes it easier for these companies to get away with their pollution, lobbying against climate action, and human rights abuses. And by accepting their money, the Science Museum is helping Shell, BP, and Equinor to do it."
In response to these protests, the Science Museum reiterated their goal of reaching net zero by 2033 and said, "The major energy companies have the capital, geography, people, and logistics to be major players in finding solutions to the urgent global challenge of climate change. We believe the right approach is to engage, debate, and challenge companies, governments, and individuals to do more to make the global economy less carbon intensive. Through research and technological innovation in areas such as carbon capture, fuel efficiency, and alternative energy such as wind, solar, and tidal, energy companies have a major role to play, and we must continue to challenge them to show more leadership to deliver on this potential. We achieve public good with the sponsorship we receive from our partners. In all such partnerships, the Science Museum Group retains editorial control."
We've spoken before about the role that fossil fuel companies are playing in the whole carbon removal space right now, whether that's financing nascent direct air capture projects, using the captured carbon for enhanced oil recovery, or indeed promoting carbon removal as part of a net zero pathway. It's complex and it's important to talk about. And to be honest, we are unlikely to resolve the whole debate today.
Yeah, and as this whole industry heats up, I'm sure it's something that we'll be hearing a lot more about over the coming months and years. We'll, of course, continue to reflect on this throughout the series.
We will put the links to both the museum's net zero policy and their response to the protesters in the show notes. Next time on the Carbon Removal Show, we're going to a party. It's not a party, it's a serious conference.
Very serious.
A whole conference just for carbon removal, where we're going to be asking, now that we're talking about how to spread the message, how can we get more people involved and make sure that carbon removal is done in the right ways? Tune in next time. See you then.
See you next time.
Stay cool, carbon fan.
Thanks to everyone who makes this show possible.
Our researcher and fact checker, Henry Irvine.
Our composer, Sam Carter.
Our graphic designer, Reke Campbell.
Our content manager, Jordan Brooks.
Our guest booker, Anna DeWolf Evans.
Our editor, Mercy Barno.
Our producer, Ben Weaver Hinks.
Our project manager, Patrick Carter.
And our executive producer, Sam Floyd. thank you so much for listening to the Carbon Removal Show. Follow us on Twitter at RestoredCC, follow us on LinkedIn at The Carbon Removal Show, and you can visit our website, restored.cc. We're all over the internet. And please remember to give us a rate and review. It really makes a difference. Thank you so much.
Co-fruition.